Welcome back to our study of the book of Daniel. In this video, we want to finish our introduction to the book by examining its historical background. We want to put the book in its historical context. And that simply means we want to be able to understand what is written in the book in the context of what was happening, in the context of who is writing to who, in the context of what are the circumstances of the audience, of the writer, that helps us to make sense of the message that is being conveyed. Well, I want to begin by starting by putting the book of Daniel in a historical timeline. And all dates in this timeline are in BC. The book of Daniel begins in the context of a succession of world empires. And as you will see, we have a succession from the Assyrian world empire. The Assyrians were the world rulers from the 900s BCs, and they're succeeded by the Babylonian Empire in about 605 BC. Somewhere in between that time, in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel came to an end at the hand of the Assyrians. And that left only the southern kingdom, Judah, which eventually became a vassal state of Assyria. Well, the growing ascendancy of the Babylonians over time result in a power struggle between the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonians. And Judah, the southern and only remaining kingdom of Israel, gets caught in the middle. Well, the Babylonians eventually defeat the Assyrians at Nineveh in 612. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and they bring the final death knell to Assyria at a place called Carchemish in 605 BC. Now, the Babylonians, they first take Nineveh, and the Assyrians, they retreat to another of their cities called Haran, and then they are trying to preserve their kingdom for a little bit longer, and the Egyptians seek to support them. And whilst en route to support the Assyrians, the Egyptians defeat the Israelite king Josiah and make Judah Egypt's vassal for a short time. But eventually, the Babylonians, as we said, take the town of Carchemish, or really they defeat the Assyrians finally at Carchemish, and they, at this point, he pursues the Egyptians southward, and during this campaign, he besieges Jerusalem, and he makes Judah a vassal of Babylon. So firstly, Judah was a vassal of the Assyrians, a vassal of the Egyptians for a short time, and then finally a vassal of the Babylonians. Whilst all this is happening, Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, dies, and Nebuchadnezzar has got to rush home to Babylon to be crowned king. He doesn't want anybody else to take the crown before he gets there. But he is the Babylonian Empire's longest reigning king, from 605 to 562 BC. He's also the greatest king of this empire. He brought Babylon to the zenith of its economic affluence and political power, and he expanded the city of Babylon and built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. In fact, upon his death, the Babylonian Empire begins to fade, and it completely collapses within 23 years of his death. As a result from Nebuchadnezzar's subjugation of Judah as a vassal state to Babylon, he takes hostages or exiles from Judah to Babylon, including Daniel and his three friends. And so Daniel and his three friends are forcibly taken to Babylon, where they would spend the rest of their lives. And then Babylon eventually has got to come back and invade Judah again in 597 BC, because the Judeans seek to rebel against the Babylonians, and so the Babylonians have got to come back to lay down the law. As a result, there is a second wave of exiles. A number of other exiles are taken from Judah to Babylon. And this group includes Ezekiel the prophet and also the king at that time, Jehoiakim, who was the son of Jehoiakim, the former king who had been made a vassal to the Babylonians. And then in 586, surprise, surprise, the Judeans are rebelling again, and the Babylonians come back this time, and on this occasion they destroy the city of Jerusalem and the temple in 586, and we have a third and final wave of exiles that are brought from Judea to the city of Babylon or into the Babylonian Empire. Now I want you to notice that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple take place during Daniel's time in Babylon, really in about his 19th year. And this would have been very disheartening to Daniel and his friends. And so the book is written in the context of a time of great despair, a time of disorientation, a time that would have been very disheartening and confusing for Daniel and his friends. Eventually, the Persian Empire succeeds the Babylonian Empire in 539 when the Persians conquer the city of Babylon. This is about 70 years from that first wave of exiles in which Daniel was included, down to the time that Cyrus the Great and the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire. So if Daniel was about 15 at the time that he was brought to Babylon, he really is about 85 years old when Cyrus the Great conquers the Babylonian Empire and he's serving under the Persian. In about 538, Cyrus the Great decrees that the Jews can return from Babylon, those who want to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and to rebuild the temple. Daniel, of course, does not return. I think he is too old, and he probably does not live long enough to hear the news of the rebuilding of the temple. And then finally, in about 516, the Jerusalem temple is rebuilt. So the picture we have of Daniel is that he's living a long life in challenging and turbulent circumstances in an environment that was hostile to his faith, but through all of this, he remains faithful to God, and he remains consistent in his keeping of God's will for his life in a circumstance of foreign domination and oppression. So the book of Daniel is set during the period of Judah's exile to Babylon, during the period of the Babylonian Empire into the beginning of the Persian Empire. And chapter 1 begins at the beginning of the exile of the first wave of Jewish exiles from their homeland in Judah to Babylon. And Daniel 1 verse 1 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, besieged Jerusalem, defeated the Judean king Jehoiakim, plundered the temple of Yahweh, and he takes some of the brightest of Judah's young men to Babylon to work in his civil service. So Daniel's among the first set of Jewish exiles to Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar's defeat of Judah, reducing it to a vassal kingdom. That occurs in 605 BC, and as we said earlier, two other waves would follow, Ezekiel and others in 597, and the rest in 586 after the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is a confusing and disorienting time for the Jews, which would have raised questions in terms of their faith, such as, where is God? Has Israel's God Yahweh been defeated because he's weaker than the gods of other kingdoms, given the defeat of Judah by Babylon? It would have raised a question for the Israelites whether their God had been defeated, and they would have asked, how can God's people remain faithful to him in a foreign land oppressed by human empires? As the psalm goes, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept, and our captors asked or demanded us to sing songs of Zion. And we said, how can we sing songs of Zion in a strange land? This is a time of confusion, disorientation, and despair. And given these questions that the Jews would have had, the book of Daniel seeks to answer them. And the answer of the book of Daniel to these questions is that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is sovereign over all nations. And so his people should not give in to fear and compromise, but they should remain faithful to him, because God will take care of them, and his kingdom in the end will in his own time triumph over the kingdoms of men. Now, I do want to see if I can chart a little bit this succession of human empires that is in the background of the book of Daniel. Firstly, we have the Assyrian Empire from, say, about the 900 to 605 BC that was succeeded by the Babylonians about 605 to 539 BC. Now, most of the book of Daniel takes place during the period of the Babylonian Empire. And most of the action, most of the events in the book take place in the city of Babylon. And what happens is that the Babylonians basically take over the land, most of the empire that formerly had been controlled by the Assyrians. The Babylonian Empire, in turn, is succeeded by and outstretched by the Persian Empire, say 539 to 331 BC. Notice the area of the Persian Empire stretches well beyond that of the former Assyrian and Babylonian empires. And the last chronological events in the book of Daniel take place during the beginning of the Persian Empire. So chapters 5 to 6 in the court tales, and the visions which take place in chapters 10 and 11, which take place during the reign of Cyrus and Darius the Mede, respectively, are in the Persian Empire. So in addition to Babylon, some of Daniel's visions take place whilst he's in the Persian city of Susa. Although none of the events narrated in the book of Daniel take place during the Greek Empire, that period is also important to the background of the book and provides some of its historical context. This is because a number of the visions in the book relate to the period after the end of the Persian Empire during the Greek Empire. Also, in the visions, there's a specific focus on a period of persecution of the Jews in Palestine by a Greek king named Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. And this king basically was responsible for a period of persecution of the Jews in Palestine during the Greek period. And so it seems, in fact, that Daniel is somehow written to encourage these Jews going through this period of persecution as a secondary or implied audience. And so we have to understand this period to make sense of these visions. Now, Daniel's apocalyptic visions predict the fall of the Persian Empire to Alexander the Great, ushering in the period of Greek rule. And on the slide depicted is Alexander and Darius III, the ruler of the Persian Empire, at the Battle of Issus, which was one of the strategic military victories that Alexander won that tipped the scales in his favor as he moved eastward in conquering the Persian Empire. The Greek conquest of the Persian Empire under Alexander the Great is described in Daniel 8 as a goat. The Greeks are described as this goat with a prominent horn coming from the west. The prominent horn is Alexander, and crossing the whole earth without touching the ground, meaning the conquest happened very quickly, and striking a two-horned ram, and that two-horned ram represented the Medo-Persian Empire, one horn greater than the other. So Medes, the small horn, the bigger horn, the Persians. So that this two-horned ram, Persia, was knocked to the ground and trampled. This is the background of that vision. Well, beginning in 334, Alexander the Great, moving from Macedonia, leads the Greeks in an attack on the Persian Empire, moving east. And by 331 BC, he defeats the Persians and eventually controls almost all the land formerly controlled by the Persian Empire. He dies suddenly in 323 BC at the age of 33 without an heir able to rule his empire, and is divided amongst his four generals who each founded dynasties. And you can see the divisions there: Ptolemy in Egypt, then Cassander in Greece, and then the other two generals Lysimachus, and Antigonus in Asia Minor. And then eventually another dynasty emerges under the rulership of a military commander named Seleucus. And you can see that they're in the eastern part of the empire, really the section that comprised Mesopotamia and keeps going towards the east. For the purposes of the visions in the book of Daniel, the kingdoms ruled by the two generals, Ptolemy, who ruled Egypt, and Seleucus, who ruled the eastern portion of the empire, are most significant. Their descendants became the Ptolemies and Seleucids respectively, and are referred to in Daniel's visions in Daniel chapter 11 as the kings of the north, the Seleucids, and the kings of the south, who are the Ptolemies. Now, Palestine and the Jews who had returned there under the Persians, they get caught in the middle of a tussle between these two kingdoms for the strategically important land bridge which this territory represents, and it passes back and forth between these powers. Eventually, in the 160s BC, whilst Palestine is in the hand of the Seleucids, one of their kings, Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, carries out a program of Hellenization in Palestine in which he tries to stamp out Jewish religion and culture. He prohibits circumcision and worship of God, making them punishable by death. He burns Hebrew scriptures. He stops the temple sacrifices. And he even goes so far as to sacrifice a pig on the altar in the temple of the Greek god Zeus. And this eventually leads to a Jewish revolt under the Maccabees, during which the Jews regained political independence for about 100 years, from 164 BC to 63 BC, until they became subject to the Romans. But this period of persecution and hardship instigated by Antiochus Epiphanes is not only in the background of some of the very specific visions in the book of Daniel, but it's also an implied audience for the book, as the book seems to encourage God's people facing oppression and persecution under foreign rule to remain faithful by assuring them of God's sovereignty. And that leads us to the final thing that I'd like for us to treat, which is the dating and the authorship of the book. So there's a debate in scholarship about the authorship, dating, and audience of the book of Daniel. The traditional view is that the author of the book is the protagonist of the book, Daniel, and that it is written sometime in the 6th century BC, that is sometime during the period in which events of the book take place, and that it is primarily addressed to Jews in exile during the Babylonian and Persian periods. Now, there is another view, because beginning about the 19th century, modern scholars, or some modern scholars, began questioning the authorship and dating of the book, primarily based on the precision of the prophecies that are contained in it about events which take place after Daniel's death, such as the rise of the Greeks and the Greek dynastic wars leading up to the kingship of Antiochus Epiphanes and the persecution of the Jews in Palestine under him. And these scholars suggested that given the precision of these predictive prophecies, it was more reasonable to believe that the book was written during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean revolt in Palestine, and that the book framed these events described as prophecies from the 6th century BC. Modern scholars have also questioned the traditional dating and authorship of the book based on linguistic features and what they perceive to be historical errors in the narrating of events in the book from the Babylonian and Persian periods. Personally, I continue to hold the traditional view that the book was written by Daniel during the 6th century BC. I won't get into the arguments for and against this position in this video, but suffice it to say that there are very good answers to the questions raised by those who challenge the traditional view. I'll try to deal with some of these questions as they appear in the text as we go through the book. I am, however, of the view that in addition to the book's original primary audience, it does seem to have in view the Jews in Palestine who were undergoing persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes. And I believe that perhaps God's Spirit was using Daniel to not only speak to his near contemporaries, but also prepare a message for those Jews who later experienced persecution during the Greek period. So the traditional view written by Daniel. Some suggest that perhaps also there were later writers who compiled the book, who perhaps did the vision section and added to what had been written in an earlier period. The traditional view is that it's written sometime during Daniel's lifetime, but others suggest it's written during the time of the Maccabees. The original audience is Jews in exile in Babylon and the Persian empires, but I believe there is also an implied secondary audience, persecuted Jews in Palestine under Antiochus Epiphanes. But in any event, there's a wider audience, God's people, the saints, throughout time, who face hardship, persecution, oppression in the human kingdoms for their faith. So ultimately, I think that the book has a wider audience. All of God's people throughout time facing hardship, persecution, or oppression in human kingdoms due to their faith. And as we study the book of Daniel, I hope for us to see how this book has a message for its contemporaries, and for later Jews 400 years afterwards, and even for us more than 1.5 millennium afterwards. In our next video, we'll begin studying together the text of Daniel chapter 1. I hope to see you then.